Thank you very much, Ian, for that introduction. And it's a genuinely a great pleasure to be with you all this evening. And what I'm going to do is run through some of my projects, but I'm going to focus mostly on the Kelpies, which for those of you who don't know or haven't seen them, they are a pair of very large-scale horse heads in Scotland. And I do know that a couple of you at least have seen them in real life, and they've become a very, very successful landmark back in Scotland. I think so far we've had around 6 million visitors to them, which, when you consider that the town they are inhabited in, they are sited in, the town of Falkirk only has 40,000 population. 6 million visitors is quite a big impact on the local community, and it really has been a transformational project for the area. But I'm going to give you a bit of context for that, and also some other projects that I've been involved in. I'm going to go back to 1997, about 10 years after I finished college. My first major outdoor public sculpture work is this particular piece here, which is called the Heavy Horse, as you can see. It's at Clydesdale, and it's right on the edge of Glasgow, in what was formerly a pretty rundown and deprived area. And this sculpture was commissioned by a business development agency for a new retail business park, and it's become a very, very successful landmark for that area. And it really opened the floodgates for a whole host of commissions to follow. It's on the entrance to the city of Glasgow, basically, as you drive from Edinburgh into Glasgow, or go the other way, of course. And it's become a really well-known, iconic landmark. And as I say, it really got me established in terms of big public sculpture. I'm also pleased to say that, given its stature beside the highway there in Glasgow, I was approached by Kelpies Scotland, who are the organisation who look after ex-servicemen and the armed forces over there in the UK. And they asked if they could use it as part of their campaign every year, around about Armistice Day, November the 11th. So I made a big copy for it. We put that on every single year since then, and it's become a very well-known landmark. It brings a lot of publicity and coverage for that very, very worthy cause. And I'm pleased to say several other of my sculptures are also either illuminated red or have some other emblem to raise the profile of the Kelpies Scotland charity, which is something I'm very proud of. But as a well-known equine sculptor and a few others which followed, I unwittingly caught the eye of Scottish Canals. Scottish Canals, obviously, as you can tell by the name, look after the canal network in Scotland, such as it is. And they had a master plan for a very large structure in Falkirk on the Forth and Clyde Canal, and they knew that I was well known for doing horses, so they got in touch and asked me if I would come up with some concepts. They had the title of the Kelpies, but they really didn't know how to take it any further. They didn't quite know what to do with that title. They asked me if I would come up with some sketches, which I duly did. And I have to say, I took it in a completely different direction from where they had been and what they were expecting. They had giant mechanical architectural shapes, which if you kind of squinted your eyes might look a little bit like horses. And I took it in a much more literal and mythological direction, and really concentrated on a pure equine interpretation of the theme. And these here are pages from one of the original sketchbooks, and you can see I'm starting to figure out the design and the ideas for the sculptures. I then took that to these drawings. I did a whole series of these little line drawings. I actually did these on Hannika's kitchen table when she was still my girlfriend in Amsterdam, and I remember sitting there drawing these sketches in her place and explaining to her that we were going to build these giant horses that were going to be 30 metres high, and she's looking at me like, what am I getting involved with here? You know, how's this going to work out? Unfortunately, these little drawings really captured the imagination of Scottish Canals and the funding agencies behind it, and really managed to kickstart the whole project. You can see it also gave an idea of scale against the landscape, the Ochil Hills in the distance there, the canal boats in the foreground. It really captured the imagination of the commissioners, and also, luckily for me, the local population. The idea kind of really was fired by the idea of working horses, the Clydesdale horses and the Shires, most especially Clydesdales, which used to work on the canals, of course, drawing the canal barges along the waterways, and were the sort of main source of industry and locomotion for all the different the heavy industries of central Scotland. This really captured my imagination. much more than the mythological connotations of Kelpies, which I kind of inherited from Scottish canals. These little sketches came about because so many young people, young kids, they would look at these big giant horses that I'd sketched, and as they kind of begin to understand, they would all say, well, where's the rest of the horses? And they thought about it in a way that adults don't really think about it, you know. So I did these series of sketches to show where the rest of the horses might be, and luckily for me, they ended up being quite lucrative, and we sold quite a few of these as limited edition prints. But moving on, we had a bit of an impasse because Scottish Canals really loved the concept, and we needed some way to make it real. And I said to them that I would make scale models of them for free, on the understanding that if the project was successfully funded, they would then pay me for the scale models and commission a second set of scale models which we can actually use for the project. And they agreed to that, and we signed all the contracts, and luckily things took a fantastic turn for the better. This is me at work in the studio drawing out the first few lines of the first model in the studio, and you can quite clearly see the shape of what became known as the head down Kelpie. And that's how all of my sculptures take shape. It's a very old-fashioned and basic way of working, but it works for me, and it certainly seems to have done the trick with the Kelpies. You can see one of the 10th scale steel models in the background of that picture, and that's me in the foreground, a very much younger version of me, making 100th scale version in clay. The tiny little 100th scale versions in clay were used as a kind of engineering tool by all the different practices involved: structural engineers, the landscape architects, the canal engineers themselves. We gave each of the main practices a set that they could have in their office to help work out all the engineering challenges. And again, I'm pleased to say they became very successful, and we subsequently cast 30 editions of these little bronze sculptures, and we've sold out them all, though it really became quite a nice little lucrative sideline, which we didn't really consider when I was working on them. But their main purpose was to aid the engineering. This interesting shot here, I remember phoning up Glasgow City Council, who at the time in one of the parks in Glasgow had some Clydesdale horses, and I said, can I borrow one of your horses for the day? And they said, sure, you can have two. And they turned up to my studio with two huge Clydesdale horses called Baron and Duke. They must have been about 1.5 tons each, absolutely massive, maybe about 18 hands or something. They were huge. And the keeper there brought them into my studio, and I could then work over the original steel models and draw on them various anatomical details just to hone the design and make it a bit more accurate. And that's just a lovely shot of me working with one of the horses there in the studio. Another shot of me in the old Glasgow studio, and you can see the two sets side by side, and they eventually became scanned and scaled up to full size. Now, the Kelpies was a long and tortuous project. It wasn't a smooth project at all. It became embroiled in terrible financial difficulties. It was happening around about the time of the Great Recession, 2008, 2009. It really had a lot of complications. So the reason I put this image in is to let you see that it wasn't the only thing I was doing at the time. There were other projects happening. Other projects were being finished, like this one in Belfast, and other projects were starting. So it wasn't the only thing I was doing, because basically I would have gone bust if I put all my eggs in one basket, so to speak. So there were lots of other projects happening at the same time, this being one of them. She's about 65 feet high, she's in Belfast. She's a monument to peace and reconciliation in that formerly very troubled city in the north of Ireland. And again, I'm pleased to say she's become a very successful and popular landmark and icon for the north of Ireland and for the city of Belfast. This is another piece that was commissioned during the process of the Kelpies. This one's called Aria. She's about 35 feet high, 10 metres. She stands beside the M80 highway in Glasgow. Just outside Glasgow on the main highway going north. Now that I think about it, I probably got most of the highways in Scotland have been covered by one of my sculptures, which is quite a nice thing to have achieved. But you can see the scale of her. She stands on an embankment beside the highway and is a very, very prominent, visible landmark for the area. Those steel models that I was making for the Kelpies, they kind of took on a life of their own, and they eventually became almost, I guess you would think of them as travelling ambassadors for the real project back in Scotland. And we were lucky enough to manage to convince the team, the partners behind the project, to give us permission to take them over to New York City, and they were there for the Tartan Week, the Scotland Week activities that they have every March in New York, and we managed to secure a spot in Bryant Park on 6th Avenue, and it was a fantastic setting for them. They sat there in New York for about 6 weeks, and it was an amazing experience, stopping the traffic on 6th Avenue in Manhattan and lifting them into place with a crane. It really was one of those surreal moments where I was pinching myself at how we managed to achieve it. They became quite a local landmark for a while. We got interviewed on morning television in New York, which was fantastic fun, even though I was actually subtitled on TV because they didn't understand my accent, which was quite something. But it was a great experience to have that exhibition, that first exhibition in New York, and it really began to spread the word of the Kelpies on an international basis. Meanwhile, back at home base, the Kelpies themselves were beginning to take the process was beginning to take shape. As I said earlier on, we scanned them. Nowadays, technology has improved vastly, but back then they had to actually plot every single piece of steel that had welded together and build up a three-dimensional model using a very, very basic technique. Nowadays, it's a completely different way of doing things. But back then, that scanning technique was in its infancy, so they painstakingly scanned every piece of steel and built up these three-dimensional models, which helped the engineers figure out calculate all the loadings on the internal steel tubes and the framework and how they were going to attach the skin to the frame. It was a very, very complicated process, but we had a fantastic team of engineers called Atkins, who were based out in Yorkshire, and they pulled together these 3D models, which made the whole thing much more doable and realistic. Those tiny models I mentioned before, they were used for wind tunnel testing. The Kelpies sit on either side of a canal, a working canal, and there was concerns about the wind coming in from the North Sea on the east coast of Scotland and how it might affect as the wind eddied between the barge, the sculptures, that it might actually blow people into the canal, or that the boats might be rocked about in the canal in between them and damage the boats. So we had to be very careful about the wind loadings and how the air, the turbulence around them would work. So those little bronze versions that I showed you earlier, this is a picture of them being taken in the National Testing Laboratory in England, where they did all the calculations to make sure that the wind loadings would be right, that the sculptures would be put at sufficient distance apart from each other, that there would be no problems. And I have to say, they obviously passed with flying colours and everything went very smoothly. Then we got into the real nitty-gritty, which was the fabrication side of things. And I kind of pride myself that most sculptures I make, I do on my own. As much as I can, and then I hire a team of guys when I need them. With a project like the Kelpies at 300 tons and 100 feet high, there was no way on earth I could personally make them. So we put it out to tender, and we had a company from Yorkshire in England called SH Structures. They were appointed to do the actual fabrication at full size, and they produced probably about 1,000 construction drawings, and this is a close-up of one. And these drawings, this gives you some idea of the scope of work and how complicated and technically demanding it was. Now, when the sculptures stand there, people kind of take it for granted, and it kind of made it look easy, but it was really an amazing feat of engineering to pull it together. They eventually won several engineering awards, which I guess is a tribute to how skillful the guys at SH Structures were. It was a great thrill for me to work with those guys. They were fantastic. They got it from the beginning. They understood. Their chief engineer took me aside on the first meeting and said, "You concentrate on making the best sculptures that we can, and then let us do the rest of it." And it was a great partnership, and I'm still great friends with the guys down there in Yorkshire. It was a fantastic part of the project to be involved in. The next few images give you an idea of how things actually came together. What you're looking at there is one of the steel trusses that runs up the back, the spine, the back of the neck of one of the Kelpies, and it gives you some sense of the scale of the work. It's more akin to building a bridge or shipbuilding really than normal sculpture making. Again, I can't stress how much it was a learning experience for me and an enjoyable part to be involved in. There's a shot of one of the guys in the welding shop in Yorkshire putting the pieces together. And of course, it all had to be transported to site up in Scotland. It took, I think it was 113 40-foot semi-trailers, took all the pieces up. They'd all been coated, painted at the factory down in England and then taken to site, and then the stainless steel skin panels were brought to site separately, and everything was stored, as you can see in this aerial photograph. They were stored in a nearby depot laid out like the biggest giant model airplane kit you ever saw in your life. It's kind of strange to look at those little pieces there and think each one's over 40 feet long. As I say, I think about 113, 115 truckloads, and then they began the assembly on site. The site was a formerly abandoned, basically it was wasteland that had been used as an industrial dump. When they started to excavate, they found chemicals and all sorts of weird and wonderful, weird and terrible things. And they had to spend a lot of money remediating the land. They had to, where they originally wanted to put them wasn't suitable, so they had to change the location. There was a whole load of things went on behind the scenes. When they finally settled on the right location for them, and they started to excavate, they realised they'd have to go down 32 metres, so that's about 115, 120 feet to the bedrock. So each concrete slab, which is maybe 1,300 tons each, sits on concrete piles that go down over 100 feet to the bedrock. It was an incredibly complex feat of engineering to even get them to the starting point. This image here shows the steel skin plates being actually clad onto the steel subframe. They lifted up each part, everything was individually labelled, and it was an amazing thing for me to go on site and see these guys actually piece together these things that I made in the studio all those years before. It was a fantastic experience. At this point, of course, we also had an interesting thing with the media, because obviously you can't keep these things secret, and the local people knew about it, and then my partners, the team behind it were trying to do press releases, and I remember saying to them, but you can't keep them secret, they're 100 feet high and they're right beside a highway, you got to go public with this. And then people were breaking into the site at night to take photographs with them. It became a much bigger public spectacle than I think anybody had ever realised they would. It was a pretty phenomenal thing, and of course being next to a highway, as you guys know, the challenge was actually that people would stop on the highway and cause car crashes to take photographs of them. So the police ended up having a more or less permanent police car on the highway to look after these things so that there wouldn't be any crashes. It was a very interesting experience. I have to say at that point as well, the media, well, it's an interesting, you need broad shoulders in this game that I'm involved in, because at that point the media were, I wouldn't say they were unanimous in their support for it, let's put it that way. There was more than one newspaper were saying that they were the biggest waste of money ever, and that I was a charlatan, and all sorts of, it was very, very, extremely hostile. It was a very, very difficult thing to work through. And interestingly, one of those newspapers just last week gave them an award for being the best tourist attraction in the country. The same newspaper who all those years previously had been saying that they were the biggest scandal they'd ever set eyes on. So, as I say, you need broad shoulders. That's a lovely image that gives you an idea of the scale of them as they began to take shape on the location. And by that time, this particular image actually made the front of the Japan Times somehow. And that's when my client team, Scottish Canals and Falkirk Council, began to really realise that they had something big on their hands when it started to make international media coverage. They were more concerned about the Falkirk Herald and the Glasgow Herald and what they were going to say, and really they were beginning to become an international draw. This is an interesting image because it shows you the scale of the canal works in between. As I mentioned before, they sit on either side of a canal. It's actually an operating canal lock which lifts boats from one level up to the next. So they had to excavate the canal. They had to make what you can see to the left of the picture there is a turning basin where the boats sail in and then can turn to sail on the rest of the way out into the main canal through to the west coast. So all of that had to be very, very carefully planned, as you can imagine. We had to use a Dutch company, Royal Haskening, who specialise in canal construction, and Balfour Beatty. It was a major undertaking, and that image just shows the scope of all the other works. We also worked with a fantastic landscape architect, a company called Ironside Farrar, based in Edinburgh, and they were another joy to work with because they really got the project, they understood, and the way that they designed the landscape around them was very sympathetic and worked incredibly well with the overall project. And there are the finished objects. As I said earlier on, 100 feet high, 300 tons each. They've become incredibly well-known landmarks. They've won me, I don't mean to show off, but they've won me quite a few awards and 4 honorary doctorates and all sorts of things. It's been really something I'm very, very proud of. Most importantly though, they've become very, very much loved local landmarks by the local people. That was the most important thing for me, was that the locals would enjoy them and take them to heart. And even now, today, you know, like every week we get emails and things on social media from local people telling us how much they love them, how much they've become part of their lives. It's been a fantastic experience. You can go on tours. They employed tour guides from the visitor centre, which is close to the sculptures. And I know a couple of us this evening have been with the tour guides and they've done the tour, and they're fantastic. So they've actually, the sculptures in a way have become a source of employment. You know, these were previously long-term unemployed people in the area who've now got jobs and livelihoods through these sculptures' creation. And as I was explaining earlier on, it's a lovely experience for me to go on site. Maybe I've got a meeting with the engineers or whatever, and I'm standing there, and the tour guides are close to me, and I can hear them telling the tourists things about me, and I'm listening in going, really? Did I do that? Is that right? Are you sure? You know? It's been another interesting thing I've just remembered. Once they've been open for a while, of course, every photographer in Scotland decided to go along and take pictures, and these days you can see them on mugs and hats and mouse mats, and every sort of merchandising thing you can see, which is good for them. I hasten to add, we don't get any of that money, but anyway. I went through to Glasgow one time, and I was in a big market where lots of artists and craftsmen all have their stalls, and they're selling all sorts of lovely knickknacks and crafty stuff, and it was all lovely. And a few of the stalls had loads of photographs of the Kelpies, and other sculptures of mine. And I was standing at one of the stalls, and I'm looking at all the postcards, and the fellow comes over and he says, "Oh, are you interested in my photographs?" I said, yeah, they're lovely pictures. And he said, "Which one?" I said, "Oh, those ones there." And he says, "Oh yeah, that's the Kelpies there, that's a local Glasgow guy, yeah." And I was like, "Oh yeah, that's interesting." He said, "Yeah, he's a super talented guy. He went to the Glasgow School of Art." "Oh really, is that right?" Yeah, okay. And as he's talking to me, I'm looking at him, and he's looking at me suddenly, his eyes went wider, and he went, "Oh, you're Andy Scott, aren't you?" I'm like, "Yeah." And I could see the poor fellow, I could see him, there's some panic in his eyes, like, copyright lawyers, oh my God. He said, "You know, I'll give you one for free." I was like, it's all right. And God bless him, he gave me 3 for the price, he gave me 4 for the price of 3, so that was very nice of him. But joking aside, it was lovely to see, it's very flattering in a way to see other people interpret them, to see them being used for photography, they've been used for advertising campaigns, for everything from Ferrari cars, for example. They brought a Ferrari to my studio, which was very nice. They gave me the keys and asked me if I wanted to take it for a spin, but I was wearing my big work boots, so I thought maybe best not do that. They've had so much publicity, it's just been incredible, and it's a very, very flattering and humbling thing to see them get such great acclaim from a home country, you know, and it really has been an amazing experience. And the lighting is really important because, as some of you will know, it's dark more than half the year in Scotland, even during the day. So lighting was something I was very conscious of from the beginning, and I remember working with a lighting designer in my studio in Glasgow, must be nearly, 15 years ago now, a long time ago, longer even. Anyway, I had made those steel models that you remember from previous image, and I remember literally lying on the ground on a freezing cold night in November in Glasgow in the driving rain with little tiny spotlights, positioning them in different places around the steel models so that we could position the real lights correctly. And I also insisted that we put lights inside the Kelpies. The client team thought I was crazy, you know, they're like, "Why would you have lights inside them?" And I was like, "Just wait and see." And this is the effect, they glow from within. My objective with this particular colour scheme is that they would look like steel that's just come out of the forge, the way that red hot steel eventually cools. And I wanted to try and echo the way the steel was made in the ironworks and steelworks across central Scotland to try and evoke that feeling of industry. And I think it came out really, really well. One of the wonderful things about the Kelpies is that, however I envisaged them, Mother Nature does other things with them that I could never have imagined. And sometimes it's truly spectacular. Some of the images that we see posted on social media really are stunning, and it's, you know, thank you, Mother Nature. It's been a really amazing thing to see some of those pictures. But the lighting, as I say, was a fantastic thing to be involved in, including the rest of the lighting on the site. One thing I forgot to mention is that the sculptures actually sit in a massive park, which I think must be several thousand acres of formerly disused land, and it's all been beautifully landscaped and planted, and it's become a huge draw for the local area. And this is a view towards the sculptures in the distance, showing how well the rest of the site is illuminated at night. And there's the big boys themselves. It's a lovely image to show them in the setting with the mountains in the distance. That's the Ochil Hills, as they're called, with a canal, and those people give you an indication of the scale of them. I have to say, at one point in the project's infancy, some of the client team, I should say, were extremely worried about the finances and said to me in a very heated meeting, I have to say, can you not make them half that size or 1/3 of that size? They're too expensive. We just want one of them. We can't do this. And it was, as I say, it was a fairly heated discussion because they had already sold the idea to the funders on them being 100 feet high. And I think this image shows that we were right to insist to keep them. Could you imagine them in that landscape at less than half that size? It really wouldn't have been the project that they are now. And I'm glad I stood my ground. And eventually, to be fair, they were one round to my side of the argument. But that image shows how well they work in the scale of the landscape with the hills in the distance. And life has gone on since then, of course. They were unveiled. It's nearly 10 years since they were actually unveiled, inaugurated by the Queen. There's a lovely picture of that in the little cards you have on the table there when the Queen came to do the inauguration. But as I say, life has evolved since then, and I've been lucky enough to land lots of other projects and commissions. This one here is Charles Rennie Mackintosh. It's a cast bronze. It's a traditional bronze statue, memorial statue. Charles Rennie Mackintosh, for those of you who don't know, was a world famous, renowned Glaswegian architect and Art Nouveau, of the Art Nouveau style. He designed the art school which I went to. So when I was asked to make a sculpture of him, it was an incredibly humbling and a very, very proud moment for me. This one was actually unveiled by Nicola Sturgeon, who we were talking about before, and she did a fantastic job on the day of unveiling this statue. Sadly, it should have been a great tribute to his anniversary, but the famous building that he designed had burnt down that very year, which was a terrible tragedy for the city of Glasgow, and for me personally, having attended that school. But it stands now in a part of Glasgow which is a lovely personal touch, is the area where my mother grew up as a little girl. And it was one of the proudest moments of my life, was taking my own mum to see this statue, which is just round the corner from where she grew up when she was just a little toddler. It was a very proud and emotional moment, and it's a lovely piece of sculpture. I wish I did more bronzes, to be honest with you. Most of the time I'm commissioned to do steelwork, but I really enjoy working with the clay and having it cast in bronze. But you know, I guess you could say I'm a victim of my own portfolio, and people ask me to do the steelwork, so you take the work when you can get it. This one is one of the pieces I made in my Philadelphia studio, and it was made for a private collector down in Mexico, a very, very wealthy individual who has a huge sculpture collection. And he asked me to make a piece for him, and this is what I made for him. And we had to ship that down in 2 pieces. It went all the way down and then bizarrely got stuck at the border in Texas for about a month, because I don't think the customs guys quite knew what to do with it. And anyway, it's in a private collection in Mexico, and it's one of my favourites that I've done. A big Minotaur, as you can see. Coming much more up to date, this is Uller. This one's in Breckenridge, Colorado, and if any of you been to Breckenridge, it's about 12,000 feet up in the mountains in the Rockies there. So that installation, for somebody who's not used to working at altitude in freezing temperatures, was a very fun experience, I can tell you. But Uller is the Scandinavian god, the Norse, the Viking god of snow, and he's kind of the emblem for the town of Breckenridge. So they asked me to make this big statue of Uller firing his bow and arrow up into the mountains to bring snow for the coming season. And it's proven to be a very successful landmark in the town of Breckenridge. Coming right up to date, and you'll be pleased to hear, this is one of the last images. This is one of the series of sculptures I did very recently for Manchester City Football Club in England. This was all commissioned just at the start of lockdown, and luckily for us, because lockdown happened, I was stuck at home. So I used the time to make a tiny little model of this particular player, and the club loved it so much they asked me to make 2 more, so it became a 3-part commission. And the sculptures stand right outside the stadium there in Manchester, and again, they've become very much loved local landmarks. This is just one of the 3, and it shows again how well the illumination can work for public sculptures. And this is the last image of the little presentation I have for you here. I wanted to finish on these because it kind of shows up an aspect of the Kelpies project that I really hadn't anticipated to have evolved quite the way it did. And they've become really international landmarks. And it's an incredible thing to see something that you started off drawing on your then girlfriend, now wife's kitchen table, to see them go from little pen sketchbook drawings and pen drawings to becoming 100 feet high landmarks being used by the country as tourism icons. The picture on the left that you see there was used in China when the British Tourism Agency decided to start trying to encourage tourism from China. And the project manager for the Kelpies, a lady called Jackie Nichol, after she'd finished the Kelpies, her company transferred her to Shanghai. She'd gone all the way over to Shanghai to build a big new skyscraper, and when she got on the subway in Shanghai, the first poster she saw was this, from the Kelpies, which she'd just left 2 months before in Scotland. She had no idea that they were there. She sent us this picture of the Great Britain campaign using the Chinese subway system in Shanghai. The other one, The Culture is Great, that was actually a poster we used at Heathrow Airport in London. And you can imagine the experience of seeing this in the main gateway into the country. It was I mean, the word we would use in Glasgow is it was a head rush. It was an absolute, you could knock me over with a feather. It was an incredibly proud moment to see something that you've poured all your energy into and started off with those little sketches becoming such a well-loved and renowned landmark. That's the last image of this little show. What I wanted to do now is throw things open to questions and hope that some of you might have some questions and we can chat about things a little bit longer. But for now, that's my little show and tell. And thanks very much for making it work.
Andy, thank you so much for that. There's obviously a lot more to producing these incredible artworks than meets the eye to us laymen in the audience tonight. But before we go into some questions, which I'm sure many people have for you, I just want to share a little personal note that I was very pleased to hear Andy talk about the stallholder in one of the markets that he went to, and didn't recognize Andy for the longest time. Because the first time I met Andy was in 2017. I don't know if he remembers.
I do, yeah.
At a project called the Quake Project, which was going to be a development of a public park in Edinburgh, which unfortunately through lack of funding didn't materialise. But there were a number of people there, luminaries and so forth, and I somehow got next to Andy and I looked at him and I said, "And what do you do?" Well, he was as charming as ever and said, "Well, I'm a sculptor." And later in the presentation, I realized, exactly what a renowned sculptor he was. So now back to you, Andy, and questions, please.
Thank you very much, Ian. I do remember that was a lovely evening, actually. Yeah, I can't believe it was all those years ago, actually. Yeah, 2017, there you go. So yes, sir.
So Andy, what are you working on the new?
Right now, I have a project for a soccer club in Minneapolis, St. Paul, the Twin Cities of Minnesota. I'm doing a project there, which is going to be not right outside the stadium, but very close, part of the development of the stadium area in St. Paul. And I'm also designing projects, one of which is in Oklahoma City. It's a competition. And the other one is for a project in Las Vegas, which is also a competition. I don't usually do competitions. Competitive tenders are fraught with problems and challenges which I don't enjoy, and to be honest with you, it's not a very good way of doing business, so I prefer to work by direct appointment. But every now and then you're invited to participate in what's called a limited competition, where there's maybe only 3 or 4 other artists submitting. So in those cases you got to kind of fancy your chances. Maybe you've got a 1 in 4, 1 in 5 chance, which is much better than a random selection. And also there was something about both of them which was particularly appealing as an artist. The one in Oklahoma City is an equine project, or at least I'm submitting an equine design. I might not get it, but that's what I'm doing, and I'm enjoying the process. The one in Las Vegas is much more somber and much more profound. You might remember 5 years ago there was a terrible, tragic shooting at a country western festival in Las Vegas. They've put out a call for designs for a memorial garden, and one of the landscape architect practices have asked me to be part of their bid, and I'm working on some designs for some sculptures for that memorial garden for the 58 people who lost their lives in that terrible event. So we were in Vegas a couple of weeks ago to meet with some of the survivors and first responders and families, and it was a deeply moving and incredibly profound experience. So yeah, I'm going to do my best for those people. And again, we might not win the project, but that's what I'm involved in at the moment, to elevate, to lift the tone a little bit. And you know, you never know in this line of business, you don't know what's coming next. You know, I can get an inquiry tomorrow for something completely different. You never know what's coming. The main one is the one for Minneapolis. I'm enjoying getting my hands on that. We just set up a new studio in Los Angeles. We've been in Philly for 5 years, so the one for Minneapolis is the first live project to start taking shape in the new studio. And it's great to be back on the tools and working away, you know, it's good stuff. Yes, sir.
Andy, one of the last slides you showed was a statue in front of Manchester City ground.
Yeah.
Was that a particular footballer?
That was Vincent Kompany, who had been the team captain at Manchester City for 10 years, I think. And he was one of the greatest players ever and a hugely popular figure still. He's now the manager of Burnley, actually, in England, and a lovely fellow. They also commissioned me to do David Silva, who had just left them. He just retired, well, not retired, he got to play in Spain. And the other one was Sergio Aguero, who was an Argentinian player who was the highest ever goal scorer. So it was fantastic to be involved in that. They were a great organisation to work for, although if any of you follow soccer, you'll see that they're getting into some hot water recently about some financial shenanigans, and I've got to say that none of that was anything to do with the statues. So yeah, no, it was very good to be, especially as a soccer fan, you know, to work for a soccer club with that stature was a fantastic experience. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Andy, could you give us an idea of the time frame for the major segments, if you will, of the project, from conceptualization, design, then to, I guess, permitting?
You mean for the Kelpies, or do you mean in general?
Well, of a typical project, maybe on the Kelpies would be a good example.
Yeah, well, the Kelpies actually is not a good example because it was so fraught with problems. The Kelpies was, I'm going to put it in context, the Kelpies was a Herculean effort. It was a once-in-a-lifetime project, not just for me as the sculptor, but for the commissioning agency as well. I very much doubt that anything of this scale will be built in Scotland in my lifetime. It was such a vast undertaking for that country. It took, in total, 8.5 years from start to finish, but I can tell you that the actual design and production and installation took 2.5 years. So there was 6 years of meetings and politicians and lawyers and bankers and disasters and financial meltdowns and inputs. And it was a very, very complicated project to be involved in. And that's aside from the actual complications of the site, the foundations and all that sort of stuff. So the short answer is just us doing our bit would have been 2.5 years, but with all the other stuff that was involved, it was an extremely arduous project. I can tell you all tonight, I nearly resigned from it about four or five times. If my wife, Annika, hadn't made me stick with it, I would have walked away because it was a very, very difficult thing to be part of. But you got to concentrate on the positives. Once we got it on site, they started to come together. It was an incredible thing to see it coming together and, you know, actually taking shape. Most projects, it's very difficult. You know, they're not on that scale. The quickest thing would probably be about 8 months to turn around from start to finish. A lot of that depends on clients. Sometimes you get them around the table and they just give you a check and tell you to get started. Other times, it can drag on an awful lot longer. Sometimes you're dependent on the rest of the construction site. You know, there's all sorts of complications and challenges can come along. Anywhere between 8 months and a year is usual. Sometimes they take a bit longer. So there's not really a straight answer, but it's fairly time consuming. You know, it's not a quick thing to be involved in. Sometimes I think I should just start making those little things and sell them. It may be a better way to make a living.
A quick follow-up. As an artist, how do you cope with, say, the public art projects, where politicians or the public, or they take, you know, sort of a poll of who likes this or who doesn't, all that sort of thing. How do you weather the open season commentary period?
Well, as I said earlier on, you need broad shoulders. You know, you put stuff out there, and you're never going to please everybody all of the time. I'm very lucky that most of my work so far, to me anyway, from what I hear, have been pretty well received. I wouldn't say unanimously, because you know, you're always going to have somebody you're annoying, but you just need broad shoulders. You need, as long as your client's happy with it and the local people who you're doing it for, they're the ones that matter. So as long as they're happy, you know, I can take it. I'm a big boy, you know. Some of it's very personal, especially with the Kelpies. Some of the things that were put in print You know, I had lawyers say to me, you know, this is serious, you know, do you want to go for this? What's the point, you know? With the newspapers, you get no right to reply. Often it can be just a form of bullying. We just need to get on with it, you know. I can say that now, at the time, especially being from Glasgow, is like, I'll find out where he lives, you know, it's a whole different mindset. But these days, you know, you just get on with it. Because the era we're in now with social media, everybody's got an opinion, and you know, all these, as you say, online polls about whether you like it or not, you know, you have to kind of rise above it, you know. And I'm always very, people often ask me, you know, what do you think about this one or that one? What do you think of that one from Manchester United? One of Ronaldo, for example, famous Sculptor, or another sort of player, which to be honest, wasn't very good. And so people will ask me, what do I think of that guy's work or that sculpture or whatever? And I always tend to avoid that line of thinking because it's not fair. I don't know what he or she had to go through. I don't know how difficult the client was. I don't know what the budget was. So I'm not going to, you know, take pot shots at somebody else when I don't know the whole story. And personally, I just do my best. I'm honoured to be commissioned in the first place. Apply myself 110% to whoever client I'm working for, and I can only just hope for the best and hope that people appreciate it, you know. I'm still here and I'm still doing it, so I guess I must be getting it right at some point. So, thank you.
Andy, as far as the Kelpie, going back to the Kelpies, I read somewhere, or I imagine, I don't know, but wasn't there some discussion about your focus on the Kelpies having a link to the canals, whereas perhaps there was other thoughts from other
There was. Well, the canal, the chief engineer of the canals was a lovely fellow called George Ballinger, and his original concept of the Kelpies was much more mythological. He envisaged the ancient Scottish legends of the hills and glens about Kelpies, which were mythological seahorses. And there's a lovely children's book called The Kelpies' Pearls, I think, and he had this whole mythical, wifty, wafty, ancient, lovely type of thing happening. And I'm like from Glasgow, a big industrial city, like I guess it'd be like Pittsburgh or somewhere, you know. And I'm thinking that means nothing to me, and it means nothing to the people of Central Scotland. It's a very different culture up there. So I took it and took it much more towards the working horses, the history of especially the Clydesdales, which was much more where I was from mentally and ancestrally. And I'm pleased to say the people of Falkirk and the local area. My own father was from Falkirk, so I knew it was much more relevant to go down that avenue. The heavy industry of the area, the working horses was much more of it. And I'm pleased to say my client at Scottish Canal, they agreed and they went with it, and it's worked out very well. But at first I actually wanted to change the name. I tried to convince them to drop the name of the Kelpies because of those mythical connotations, because I didn't think it was relevant. But now I actually quite like that there's that duality. So people, if they want to imagine the hills and glens and the wifty wafty Highland stuff, that's okay, that's up to them, you know, they enjoy that. But if they want to look into the heavy horses and the industrial side of it, then that's absolutely fine too. So I'm much more happy with it now, and it's cool, it's the way they are. But yeah, my avenue of thought and investigation as an artist was much more to do with the heavy horses rather than the mythological stuff. Yes, sir.
So you.
Oh.
Speaking of the mystical whiffy-waffy, have you ever exhibited at the Burning Man Art Festival in
No.
Nevada?
No.
Have you ever considered it?
No.
Have you ever? I can tell you haven't attended.
I haven't attended, and the guys I used to work with in Philadelphia, I used to go every year, and I've seen enough and heard enough from them to know that it's not for me. I've done enough difficult installs to know that I don't want to be in the middle of the Black Rock Desert in 40 degrees centigrade, 110 degree heat. You know, I really don't think it's my cup of tea. To be fair, to be honest with you, I think the type of art which is shown at Burning Man is temporary art, is there as a prop. What I make is semi or permanent or semi-permanent, and that's a more theatrical thing. And I did that sort of work at one point a long time ago in my life, and it's not for me. I don't enjoy it that much. And I'm also curious at Burning Man about who actually funds it, like who pays these things to happen and how it all goes together. Because for me, I certainly couldn't take the risk of working on something for a year and a half to stick it in the desert and hope that somebody might buy it. And if I was to say that to my wife, she'd have me, you know, that's not going to happen, you know. So business-wise, I can never see how it works unless you're lucky enough to be independently wealthy, which I'm not. So for me, it wouldn't really work. I've seen some fantastic pictures, especially some of the more glamorous, shall we say, pictures of Burning Man. I thought maybe I could give it a go, but again, my wife would that wouldn't be happening. So no, it's not my cup of tea. You never know. Maybe if somebody did commission me at some point, but I don't think so. Yes, sir.
So my question is about mentorship, and who was your principal mentor at the Glasgow School of Art? And did you get your idea to do something on this grand scale from that?
No.
And who are you mentoring now?
My tutor at Glasgow School of Art, in the sculpture department, there was 3 or 4. The head of the department was a chap, a Welsh chap actually called Cliff Bowen, who's a very nice chap, fantastic. But I was actually saying earlier on, I think I learned more in the 5 years after I left art school than I did while I was at art school. Real life teaches you much more than the sheltered institution of the art school. They taught me the very basics.
Yeah.
But to be fair, the tutors who were at the art school, and you might say this is true for a lot of art education, they are there as tutors, and if they're there as tutors, then they're not being artists. That's a bit harsh, because I know some people do actually practice both, but they had never built things on the scale that I wanted to build them, because they were busy being good tutors. So there was only so much they could teach me in that aspect. So I learned much more. I taught myself a lot of stuff. I learned much more in the first few years after leaving on construction sites and working with architects and such like, and picking up every day is a day at school. I learned more from the welders and the electricians on building sites than I did from the people at the art school. The art school taught me all the basics, and I guess gave me a grounding in life. But in real terms, it was afterwards. For mentoring, I don't have any mentees in a formal aspect. We certainly are inundated with requests from young students. We always are at pains to reply to everybody. But having somebody actually work with me wouldn't work for a number of reasons, because I don't have the time to teach somebody all the basics that they would need to know to work with me. And there's a whole host of other health and safety reasons and insurance reasons that make it very difficult to do. So much as we support education and certainly contribute in many, many aspects, in practical terms, it's not really a very easy thing to do, unfortunately. But just this week I was sent a whole bunch of sketchy drawings by a little kid who I think is 7 years old in Scotland, and I told him he was excellent, he had to keep up the good work and all that kind of stuff. So, on an informal basis, it's always something we're very proud to be part of. Any other questions? Have I gone on long enough? Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Andy. That was incredibly educational. I had no idea that the foundations of the Kelpies went down as far as they went up.
Yeah.
That's absolutely incredible, and it's certainly been a pleasure for us all to have somebody of your stature in the art world speak to us this evening. Thank you so much.
Thanks everybody for listening. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.